On a Sabbath morning in a village of maybe 300 people, a crowd of men walked one of their own out to the edge of a hill to throw him off it. There was no trial, no charge was read, no sentence was passed, because the village had no authority to pass one. Between 50 and 100 grown men simply stood up in the middle of a religious service, took hold of a man they had known since he was a child, and marched him toward a drop. And this is the part that should stop you. In a farming settlement that size, where families had been marrying into each other for generations, a large share of the men with their hands on him were related to him. By blood, by marriage, by both. Those were his uncles, his cousins, the men whose terraces bordered his family's fields, whose walls touched theirs, who had watched him learn to walk. He got away. Luke gives us one sentence and no explanation. Passing through their midst, he went away. And then he left, not for an afternoon. He walked out of the village that raised him, went down out of the hills, and made his home 2 days away among strangers on a lakeshore in a town where nobody had known his mother. Why? That is the question, and the answer is not the one this story is usually told with. The Gospels give us one specific sentence, easily missed, that turns the whole thing around. And almost nobody who tells this story reads it out loud. Start with the ground, because the ground is the first thing that tells you this was not a temporary move. Nazareth sits on a limestone ridge in Lower Galilee, roughly 350 meters above the level of the sea. The air up there is thin and dry, and the winter nights come close to freezing. Capernaum sits on the northwestern shore of the lake, about 210 meters below sea level. Between them, 45 to 50 kilometers of walking, 2 to 3 days on foot, and close to 600 meters of descent. When Luke describes the move, he uses a Greek verb that means, plainly, he went down. Luke 4:31. Translators have sometimes handled it as an idiom, the way we might say a person went down to the coast. It is not an idiom. It is a measurement. Jesus of Nazareth physically descended out of the hill country into a basin below sea level, and he never went back to live in the village he came from. Now, the year. It can be reconstructed, though not to the day. Luke anchors everything to a political synchronism. John the Baptist began his work in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius. Luke 3:1. Depending on how Luke counted the regnal years, that gives us the year 28 or the year 29. He also says Jesus was about 30 years of age when he began. Luke 3:23. That word "about" is Luke's own hedge, not a modern qualification imposed on him. The honest reading puts him in the early 30s, not at any exact number. Rome ruled, but Rome was not standing in the street. The emperor governed the empire from the island of Capri. Galilee was not a Roman province at all. It belonged to Herod Antipas, a son of Herod the Great, who had held the region since the year 4th before the Common Era. Remember him. He taxed the lake this story ends up on, and within a few years he would arrest and execute John the Baptist. Beyond the point where the Jordan feeds the lake, the land belonged to a different ruler, his brother Philip. That boundary is going to matter, because there was a place on the road where you paid to cross it. Now, the two towns. Nazareth does not appear in the Hebrew Bible. It does not appear in Josephus, who names dozens of Galilean villages and personally fortified several of them. It does not appear in the early rabbinic writings. That silence tells us something true. This was a place too small for anyone keeping records to bother writing down. What excavation has recovered is exactly what you would expect. Rock-cut cisterns, grain silos, terraces, wine presses, tombs cut into soft limestone. Yardena Alexandre of the Israel Antiquities Authority excavated a first-century dwelling beside the modern basilica complex. A village of farmers, living on what they grew, carving their storage out of the hillside because the hillside was soft enough to carve. Capernaum was a different kind of place. The archaeologist Jonathan Reed estimates its population at around 1,000, with the wider scholarly range running from about 600 to 1,500. It sat on the road network connecting the coast and Egypt to Damascus. It had a customs post, which means goods and travelers crossing that territorial boundary passed through it and paid. And it had a working waterfront. Surveys by Mendel Noon during periods of low water documented a stone seawall and promenade running several hundred meters along the shore, with piers built out from it. That is not a village with boats pulled up on sand. That is infrastructure. Capernaum also exists outside the Gospels. Josephus mentions it twice, once describing a productive spring in the fertile plain of Gennesaret that the locals called Capernaum, and once recounting how he was thrown from his horse near the village and carried into it injured. Thin testimony, but real first century, and from a man with no interest whatsoever in the story we are telling. One village of farmers on a ridge, unrecorded by anyone. One town of 1,000 on a trade road by the water, with a harbor and a tax booth. The Sabbath morning that ended, everything began as an ordinary religious service. Luke says Jesus came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. Luke 4:16. Two things established in half a verse. This was the village that formed him, and attending that assembly was not an occasion, it was habit. One caution before we go in, because it will change what you picture. No first-century synagogue building has ever been archaeologically confirmed at Nazareth. The Greek word we translate as synagogue means, at root, an assembly, a gathering. It names people before it names architecture. In a village of 200 to 400, the Sabbath gathering may well have happened in a house or in a room set aside for it. What follows may not have taken place in a hall at all. It may have happened in somebody's front room, with the neighbors standing. The service ran in 3 movements: a reading from the Torah, a reading from the prophets, then teaching on what had been read. Whether a fixed cycle of appointed readings was already in force this early is disputed, so we cannot say whether the passage he received that morning was assigned to him or chosen by him. What Luke does give us, with a precision that is almost cinematic, is the choreography. He stood up to read. The scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. He unrolled it and found the place. He read. Then he rolled the scroll back up, handed it to the attendant. Luke uses a specific word, the hyperetes, the servant of the assembly whose duties included the physical custody of the scrolls. And he sat down. Every one of those movements is a signal, and every man in that room could read all of them. You stood to read scripture out of respect for the text. You sat down to teach. The instant he sat, everyone present knew an exposition was coming, which is exactly why Luke's next line reports that the eyes of everyone in the assembly were fixed on him. That silence was not surprise. It was anticipation. The room went quiet on purpose. Notice what has already been demonstrated before he says a word. Hebrew was written without vowels. A reader supplied the vowel sounds and the sense from knowledge, not from the page. That is a trained competence, and in a farming village of a few hundred, it would not have been universal. The man who sat down had it. What he had read was Isaiah chapter 61. Good news for the poor, release for captives, sight for the blind, freedom for the oppressed. The year of the Lord's favor, Jubilee language, the vocabulary of debts canceled, land returned, lives handed back. And then he stopped. Isaiah's sentence runs on into the day of vengeance of our God, and he closed the scroll before that clause. Many readers have taken the omission to be the message. The text does not comment on it, but the cut is there for anyone who compares the two passages. Then he sat down in a room where every eye was on him, and said that the scripture they had just heard was fulfilled in their hearing. Their first reaction was not anger. Luke is careful about this, and most retellings get it wrong. They marveled at the gracious words that came out of his mouth. Luke 4:22. Approval. And then, in the same breath, the question that starts to turn. Is not this Joseph's son? Stop there, because that question is about your life as much as it is about his. There is a kind of deafness that only exists between people who know each other well. Not the deafness of a stranger with no reason to listen. The other kind, where the listening is blocked by everything you already know. They had watched him grow up. They knew the family, knew the trade, could have named his cousins. And that knowledge, which should have made them the first to believe him, is exactly what got in the way. I want you to think of one specific person before we go any further. Not a category, a person. Someone whose voice you have already discounted because you know their history, know what they were like at 17, know who their parents are. If something true came out of that person's mouth this week, could you hear it? Tell me in the comments. Not who they are, just whether you think you could. That is the one I want to read, because in Nazareth they could not. And the next sentence tells us why. Here is the line most versions of this story leave out entirely, and it changes the shape of everything we are watching. Still sitting, Jesus answers a complaint that nobody in the room has said out loud. He tells them, "You will surely quote me the proverb, 'Physician, heal yourself.' And then this, 'What we have heard you did at Capernaum, do here in your hometown as well.'" Luke 4:23. Read that again, slowly. "What we have heard you did at Capernaum." Nazareth had already heard about Capernaum, which means that before this Sabbath, before the reading, before any of it, he had already been active in that lakeside town. John's Gospel preserves a fragment of the same picture. After the wedding at Cana, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there a few days. John 2:12. So the simple chain this story is usually told with, "He was rejected in Nazareth, and therefore he moved to Capernaum," is contradicted by Luke himself, 3 verses before the rejection even happens. The truth is more tangled and considerably more human. There was already a connection to the lake. What Nazareth did that morning did not create it. It closed the door behind him, and it exposes the real grievance, which is not the theological objection you would expect. They are not saying, "We do not believe you." They are saying, "We heard what you gave them. Do it here. Do it for us. We are your people, and they got it first." That is not skepticism. That is the resentment of the overlooked home. His answer to that demand is what turns the room. He reaches into their own scriptures and picks 2 stories every man there had known since boyhood. There were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, he says, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years and famine covered the land. And Elijah was sent to none of them. He was sent to a widow in Zarephath, in the region of Sidon. Foreign ground. And there were many lepers in Israel in the time of Elisha, and not one of them was cleansed. Only Naaman the Syrian, the commander of an enemy army. Luke 4:25-27. 2 episodes from the covenant people's own history in which the covenant people were bypassed. He does not soften them. He does not explain them. He selects the two clearest cases in the Hebrew Scriptures where the power of God went out past the border, and lays them in front of men who have just demanded that the power stay home. Luke says they were all filled with wrath. Luke 4:28. Now put a number on that room. If Reed's estimate is right, and the village held 200 to 400 people, the adult male assembly on a Sabbath morning was on the order of 50 to 100 men. And in a small agricultural settlement where marriage happened within a handful of families across generations, a substantial share of them were his relatives. Mark tells us elsewhere that even his own family, at one point, went out to seize him because they believed he had lost his mind. Mark 3:21. The friction did not stop at the door of the assembly. They rose up, Luke says, drove him out of the town, and brought him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, in order to throw him down. Luke 4:29. Now, here is where I have to tell you what the text does not say, because the silences in this scene are enormous and they are the most human part of it. We are not told whether anyone hesitated. Somewhere in that crowd, there had to be a man who had eaten at Joseph's table, a cousin, someone who had worked beside him on a roof beam or a wall. Did one of them stop halfway up the slope? Did anyone let go? Luke gives us a single collective subject, they, and never breaks it apart. We are not told what the women of the village were doing. In a settlement that size, on a Sabbath morning, the movement of 50 to 100 men out of the assembly and up toward the ridge would have been visible from every doorway. Mary was almost certainly still living in that village. The text does not tell us where she was that morning, and nobody honest can tell you either. And we are not told a single name, not one. We know the names of the men who arrested him in Jerusalem 3 years later, the name of the priest who tried him, the name of the governor who sentenced him. Of the 50 to 100 men who tried to kill him first, the ones who had known him longest, the record preserves nothing. They went back down the hill and returned to their fields, and the tradition never learned what any of them were called. Look at the method, too, because the method tells you the state they were in. This was not a stoning. A stoning is a legal execution with rules, witnesses, a charge, a procedure. This was not a trial. Nazareth had no authority to try a capital case, and none to carry one out, since that power belonged to Rome. What Luke describes is an improvised killing in the open air, with no form and no charge, by a crowd of relatives walking a man to an edge. Where that edge was, we do not know. Tradition, since at least the Byzantine period, has pointed to the Mount of Precipice, the height called Jebel Kafse, 2 to 3 kilometers southeast of the old village, falling sharply towards the Jezreel Valley. But there is a practical problem worth saying out loud. Luke describes a spontaneous mob in the grip of immediate rage, and 2 to 3 kilometers is a long, deliberate march for a spontaneous mob. The ridge Nazareth sits on carries nearer drops at the settlement's own edge, 10 to 15 meters or so, more than enough for the purpose, and consistent with Luke's statement that the town was built on a hill. The text names no location. Anyone who shows you a photograph and calls it the exact spot is showing you a tradition, not a fact. Then, passing through their midst, he went away. He made that walk once. He never made it back the other way to live. What happened between the hillside and the lake shore? No gospel records. We do not know which road he took, whether he went that same day or weeks later, or whether anyone walked beside him. What we do know is the ground under his feet. Nazareth is limestone country, pale, soft, easy to cut, which is why that village is riddled with rock-hewn cisterns and silos and tombs. The stone around him his entire life was white. Capernaum is built of basalt, black volcanic rock, the geology of the northern lake basin, hard and dark and difficult to dress. A man raised among white stone walked, over 2 days, into a village of black ones. That is not a metaphor invented for a documentary. It is what the walls were made of. The descent also took him out of one economy and into another. Nazareth grew barley and olives and figs, and largely ate what it grew. Capernaum ran on fish, salt, freight, and tolls. The lake fed 3 main kinds of catch. The tilapia the locals called musht, the barbels known as bini, and vast running shoals of sardines. Men worked it with circular cast nets thrown from the shallows, long drag nets hauled between boats or up onto the beach, and trammel nets set out at night. Down the shore at Magdala, the Greek name for the town was Tarekie, roughly the place of salted fish. The town was named after the industry. We know what those boats looked like because we have one. In 1986, a drought dropped the water level near Kibbutz Ginosar and exposed a wooden hull in the mud. Excavated under Shelley Waxman, it measures about 8 meters long and 2.5 wide, built from a patchwork of at least 10 species of timber, the signature of a working boat repaired over and over by people who could not afford a new one. Radiocarbon dating and construction technique place it across the turn of the 1st century. It is not the boat of anyone in this story. It is simply the kind of boat from the right lake in the right century. And the water was not free. Fishing rights on that lake were controlled and taxed by the administration of Antipas. Fishermen worked under concession, and the catch moved through collection points before it was sold or salted. So the toll booth where a man named Levi sat in Mark 2:14 belonged to the same fiscal machine that had a grip on the working lives of Peter and Andrew. When those men later walked away from their nets, they were not just changing jobs. They were walking out of a system that owned a share of everything they caught. Then came the first Sabbath in the new town, and everything that had happened in Nazareth happened again. The same institution, the same day of the week, the same man teaching, and it came out the other way. They went into Capernaum, Mark says, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and taught. And they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority, and not as the scribes, Mark 1:21 and 22. Astonished, not offended, same voice, same kind of room, same day of the week, 2 days' walk away. What follows in Mark reads like a man's first day in a new life. In the assembly, there is a confrontation with a man crying out, and the report of it spreads through the whole surrounding region. Then he goes straight from the assembly into the house of Simon, whose mother-in-law is lying sick with a fever, and she is raised up. Mark 1:29 through 31. That house is worth pausing on because we may be able to stand in it. Inside a residential block at Capernaum, excavators found a modest basalt house showing ordinary 1st century domestic life that then stops being ordinary. One room was replastered again and again. The pottery shifts from cooking ware to storage jars and lamps. Graffiti were scratched into the walls. In the 4th century, the house was enclosed in a precinct, and in the 5th, an octagonal church was built directly over it. Someone, very early, was treating that one room as different from every other room in the block. That the house's 1st century is established. That it was Peter's is tradition, a chain of veneration, not a proof. And then, at sundown, when the Sabbath restrictions lifted and people could carry the sick through the streets, this: the whole city was gathered together at the door. Mark 1:33. Hold those 2 crowds side by side, because this is the center of the entire story. In Nazareth, the whole assembly rose up together and walked a man to the edge of a hill to throw him off it. In Capernaum, the whole city gathered together at a door to be healed. Same man, same message, same season or close to it. 2 towns, 2 crowds, 2 doors. There is one more thing that happened in that town, and it closes the argument that got him thrown out of the other one. A centurion in Capernaum sends word that his servant is dying. He is not Jewish. The local elders vouch for him and tell Jesus that this man built their synagogue. Then he sends a second message asking Jesus not to come under his roof at all, because he does not consider himself worthy, and because he understands authority well enough to know that a word given at a distance is enough. And Jesus says he has not found faith like that in Israel, Luke 7 and Matthew 8. Whether the man commanded Roman legionaries or troops in the service of Antipas is debated. No Roman legion was garrisoned in Galilee at this date, which makes the second reading more likely. Either way, he was an outsider to the covenant, and the synagogue he paid for may still be under our feet. The white limestone building standing at Capernaum today is centuries too late, dated by coins and pottery beneath its floors to the 4th or 5th century. And some specialists argue later still. But underneath it lie basalt walls and a basalt pavement, unmistakably earlier. Some excavators identify that substructure as the 1st century synagogue. Others dispute it. The basalt is older. Whether it is a synagogue is still argued by the people who have actually dug there. Now look at what has happened across these 2 towns. In Nazareth, he said, prophetic power has always gone outward, to a Sidonian widow, to a Syrian general. They tried to kill him for saying it. In Capernaum, a Gentile officer proved him right. And that is not a coincidence of geography. It is the point. Matthew records the relocation in plain terms. Leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum by the sea, in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali, Matthew 4:13, and then does something unusual. He explains it himself with a quotation. The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light. Isaiah 9, quoted in Matthew 4. To feel the weight of that, you have to know what happened to those 2 territories. Zebulun and Naphtali were the first Israelite lands torn away by the Assyrian Empire, taken by Tiglath-Pileser III in 733 and 732 before the Common Era. 2 Kings 15:29 records it, and so do the Assyrian royal inscriptions. First conquered, first depopulated, first resettled with foreign peoples, which is how the region ended up called Galilee of the Gentiles at all. 7 centuries of being the part of Israel that got broken first. And Isaiah's promise was that the region humiliated first would be honored first. Matthew's argument is that the move we have just traced is that promise landing. The light does not dawn in Jerusalem. It does not dawn in the hometown. It dawns in the province that had been broken longest, in a border town on a trade road, among fishermen and toll collectors, and a foreign officer. The same pattern as Elijah sent past the border to Zarephath, and Elisha healing a Syrian. The pattern Nazareth heard and understood perfectly well, and could not accept. 2 things keep this from being a comfortable story, and both of them belong here. The first is that Capernaum does not come out of the Gospels as the good town. Later, Jesus turns on it directly. And you, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven? You will be brought down to Hades. Matthew 11:23. The indictment of the town that received him is harsher than anything said about the village that expelled him. A crowd at your door is not the same thing as a town that has understood you. The second is that he never got the name off. He left the village. The village stayed in his name. Through the whole of the ministry, he is Jesus of Nazareth, in the accusations, in the arrest, And finally on the board, Pilate ordered nailed above his head, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. John 19:19. The place that walked him to a cliff edge supplied the name Rome wrote over his execution. One loose end before we finish. Mark also tells of a hometown rejection, the neighbors taking offense, Jesus unable to do any mighty work there, marveling at their unbelief. Mark 6. But he places it later in the ministry and describes no violence at all. Whether Mark and Luke are describing the same morning told differently, or two separate visits to the same unforgiving village, the Gospels do not settle, and neither will I. So, why did Jesus leave Nazareth? Not because of one bad morning. There was already a life at the lake before that Sabbath. Luke's own account admits it. There was a demand that he perform at home what they had heard he performed elsewhere. There was his refusal, framed in the two stories most likely to enrage them. And there was a crowd of his own relatives on a hillside who ended any possibility of return. He walked 600 meters downhill and started again among people who had no history with him at all. Not in triumph, and not in retreat. He did not argue his case. He did not stage a proof. He did not stay and wait to be vindicated by the people whose opinion should have mattered most. He took a message that was true in a room where it could not be heard, and carried it 2 days downhill to a room where it could, which leaves the harder half of it, and the harder half is not about him. Every one of us has a Nazareth, the people for whom we will always be the version of ourselves we were at 19, who will accept almost any change in us except one that happened in front of them. Some of you have been on the receiving end of that this year, and you know exactly what it costs. But every one of us is also somebody's Nazareth. There is at least one person whose history you know so well that you have quietly stopped listening. Not out of malice, out of familiarity. You knew who they were, so you decided you knew what they could be, and the door closed so gradually you never heard it shut. If someone came to mind while I was saying that, send them this video today. It will land better from you than from anyone else. And if you want to keep walking these roads with us, into the towns and the houses, and the years the Gospels move through in a single line, subscribe and stay with us. One last question, and I do want to read the answers. If you had been sitting in that assembly that Sabbath morning, knowing the family, knowing the trade, knowing everything everyone else in the room knew, do you think you would have stood up with them or stayed in your seat? Be honest below, and then go and listen to somebody you have already made up your mind about.